December 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, before dawn. The carrier sits low in the water, her hull scarred black by fire and shrapnel. The flight deck is warped, elevator shafts are twisted metal graves. To Japanese naval intelligence, she is finished, another American flat top crossed off a chalkboard in Tokyo. But on the pier, the night is alive. Arc welders flare against the darkness. Steel plates are lowered into place by cranes working without pause. Men with oil-blackened hands crawl into compartments still smelling of smoke and burned paint. Some have been awake for 20 hours, some longer. No bands play here, no cameras roll. Only the relentless sound of hammers, torches, and shouted measurements. Across the Pacific, Japanese admirals calculate timelines. Months, they believe, a year perhaps. Enough time to press the advantage, enough time to win the war at sea. They do not see what is happening here. They do not understand that this carrier, broken, burned, declared dead, is already being prepared to fight again. And as dawn breaks over Pearl Harbor, the quiet truth becomes clear. The war's outcome will hinge not only on battles fought at sea, but on what happens in places like this. By the time the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, both the United States and Imperial Japan understood that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the decisive instruments of naval power. But they understood that reality in profoundly different ways. Japanese naval doctrine was built around the idea of the decisive battle. For decades, Imperial Japanese Navy planners had studied the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan and adapted them to their own strategic needs. The concept was elegant and fatalistic: attrit the enemy fleet as it crossed the Pacific, then annihilate it in a single climactic engagement near Japan's defensive perimeter. Victory would come not through endurance, but through precision and finality. This philosophy shaped how Japanese admirals thought about ships. A carrier was not merely damaged or degraded, it was either combat effective or removed from the equation. Severe damage, especially to flight decks, elevators, or propulsion systems, was assumed to sideline a ship for months, in some cases permanently. Japanese industrial capacity, limited by raw materials and shipyard space, reinforced this belief. Repairs were slow, replacement was uncertain, losses were meant to be avoided, because recovery was difficult. The U.S. Navy entered the war with a different, less romantic inheritance. American naval planners had long accepted that the United States might be outnumbered early in a Pacific conflict. Their answer was not to seek a single decisive moment, but to survive long enough for industry to overwhelm the enemy. Ships were designed with damage control in mind, compartmentalization, redundancy, and repairability baked into steel. Even before the war, U.S. fleet exercises assumed carriers would be hit, burned, flooded, and then somehow return. This difference in mindset was invisible in the early months of the war. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese confidence soared. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, American air power in the Pacific crippled. And although the U.S. carriers had not been present during the attack, Japanese planners believed it was only a matter of time before they too would be caught and destroyed. Early engagements seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, USS Lexington was lost after catastrophic internal explosions. USS Yorktown was heavily damaged, her flight deck scarred, her boilers compromised. Japanese reports assessed her as likely sunk, or at best, removed from combat for months. The conclusion seemed logical. Carriers were complex machines. Damage like this took time. Then came Midway. Japanese planners believed they faced only 2, perhaps 3 American carriers. Their calculations were based on known losses and estimated repair timelines. Yorktown, they believed, could not possibly be present. Yet when aircraft rose from the sea on the morning of June 4, 1942, they did so from 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown herself. The shock was profound, but not fully understood. Japanese after-action reports acknowledged surprise, but the deeper implication was missed. This was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the product of a system that valued speed of recovery as much as firepower. Yorktown had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours, a feat Japanese planners did not believe possible. Still, the lesson did not fully sink in. Throughout 1942, Japanese naval intelligence continued to underestimate American repair capability. Damage reports were interpreted through a Japanese lens, one shaped by limited dockyards, rigid timelines, and an assumption that severe damage equaled strategic removal. Carriers struck at Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and Guadalcanal were often marked as out of action for extended periods. But American carriers kept returning. Burned flight decks were resurfaced, flooded compartments were sealed and reinforced. Bent steel was cut away and replaced, sometimes while the ship was still afloat. The United States was not just fighting a naval war, it was fighting an industrial one, measured in man-hours, weld seams, and sleepless nights. And behind every unexpected American reappearance at sea was a repair yard working faster than the enemy believed possible, a reality rooted in doctrine, preparation, and a quiet acceptance that survival depended on recovery. Those yards and the philosophy behind them would soon become as decisive as any carrier air group. The speed with which American carriers returned to battle was not accidental. It was the result of decades of planning that treated repair not as a rear area luxury, but as an extension of combat itself. Before the war, the U.S. Navy had already accepted a harsh geographic truth: the Pacific was vast, and the nearest fully equipped shipyards were thousands of miles from potential battlefields. If damaged ships had to return to the West Coast for every major repair, the fleet would bleed away long before industry could replace it. The solution was radical for its time: forward repair as doctrine. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard was not merely a base, it was designed to function as an emergency industrial complex. Dry docks, machine shops, foundries, electrical repair facilities, and skilled civilian labor were positioned within reach of the fleet. Floating dry docks could be towed forward. Repair ships accompanied task forces, carrying spare parts, welding equipment, and specialists trained to improvise under fire. American naval architects had also designed ships with repair in mind. Hull sections were standardized, systems were modular, electrical cabling could be rerouted, plumbing could be isolated. Damage control training emphasized not just stopping flooding and fire, but preserving the ship's ability to be fixed later. Survival was not the end goal. Recoverability was. This philosophy extended beyond the Navy itself. Civilian shipyard workers were integrated into war planning long before the first shots were fired. When war came, thousands of skilled welders, machinists, electricians, and engineers were mobilized almost overnight. Many had worked on commercial vessels, oil tankers, or pre-war naval contracts. Now they found themselves racing the clock, knowing that every hour saved in the yard translated into combat power at sea. Pearl Harbor after 1941 was a place of constant urgency. The attack had devastated the yard's infrastructure, yet repairs began almost immediately. Ships damaged on December 7th were being patched, refloated, and rearmed within days. The lesson was not lost on naval leadership. If battleships could be raised from the mud, carriers could be returned to service faster than anyone imagined. On the mainland, West Coast yards expanded at unprecedented speed. Mare Island, Puget Sound, and San Diego operated around the clock. Temporary buildings went up, new cranes were installed, rail lines brought in steel and components without pause. Repair schedules overlapped. Crews worked in shifts that blurred into one another, driven by a simple priority list: carriers first. Japanese intelligence saw only fragments of this system. Reports of damaged American ships filtered through submarines, aerial reconnaissance, and post-battle estimates. But what could not be seen was the tempo inside the yards. Japanese planners assumed repairs followed predictable industrial rhythms: weeks of assessment, months of work, long periods of inactivity. That assumption reflected their own experience. Imperial Japan lacked the same depth of industrial redundancy. Shipyards were fewer, materials were scarce, skilled labor was tightly concentrated and irreplaceable. When a carrier like Shokaku or Zuikaku was damaged, repairs were deliberate and slow. Losses created bottlenecks. Time became an enemy. The Americans treated time differently. Repair crews were authorized to cut corners where possible, not on safety, but on perfection. Cosmetic damage was ignored. Non-essential systems were deferred. The question was never, is the ship fully restored? It was, can she launch aircraft and take hits again? This mindset baffled Japanese observers. In Japanese doctrine, a carrier returned to battle only when fully fit. In American practice, a carrier returned as soon as she could fight. That difference meant American ships often reappeared with scars still visible: patched decks, uneven paint, temporary fixes, but fully operational air groups. By late 1942, the pattern was undeniable. Carriers thought removed from the war returned within weeks. Others rotated through yards and back to the front in cycles Japanese planners had not anticipated. The U.S. Navy was not preserving ships, it was regenerating them. And regeneration, once established, is difficult to stop. This unseen engine of repair would soon intersect with the realities of combat in ways that shocked Japanese leadership, not through a single revelation, but through repeated, unsettling surprises that forced a reevaluation of what damage truly meant. Those surprises would become clearest when examined from multiple angles: human, technological, and strategic, each revealing a different facet of the same miscalculation. Inside the repair yards, the war was measured in exhaustion. Men slept where they could, on tool chests, beneath scaffolding, against bulkheads still warm from cutting torches. Shifts officially lasted 12 hours, but few left when the whistle blew. Coffee was constant, so were burns, crushed fingers, and lungs full of metal dust. These workers were civilians, but they understood the stakes as clearly as any sailor on deck. Many had brothers or sons at sea. They took pride in speed, not appearance. Weld seams did not need to be beautiful, they needed to hold. A patched flight deck that could support landings by morning was worth more than a flawless repair finished a week too late. Foremen tracked progress with chalk on steel plates. Every line erased meant another hour gained. There were no victory announcements when a carrier sailed, just tired nods. The reward was knowing the ship would fight again. American carriers were complex machines, but they were designed to break in survivable ways. Flight decks were sacrificial by design. Beneath them, structural supports could be reinforced or replaced in sections. Elevators could be bypassed. Hangar decks were compartmentalized to prevent fires from spreading uncontrollably. Electrical systems were redundant, allowing rerouting around damaged circuits. Welding replaced riveting as the primary repair method. It was faster, stronger, more adaptable. Prefabricated steel sections could be installed without dismantling large portions of the ship. Temporary fixes became permanent later, if needed. Japanese carriers, by contrast, relied more heavily on lighter construction and centralized systems. They were fast and deadly, but less forgiving under damage. Repairs demanded precision and time. American carriers built ships that could be hurt and then healed quickly. From Tokyo, the picture looked different. Japanese admirals assessed damage through doctrine and experience. When reports described fires, deck damage, or flooding, planners assumed long-term removal from combat. It was not arrogance alone, it was projection. Japanese yards could not achieve rapid turnaround, so neither could the enemy. Each American carrier marked out of action became a strategic assumption. Force ratios were calculated accordingly. Operations were planned on paper strengths that did not reflect reality. When those assumptions proved wrong, explanations were sought in chance or misreporting, not systemic difference. That blind spot would grow more dangerous with every battle. And as these three forces, human endurance, technological adaptability, and strategic miscalculation continued to interact, their consequences would soon emerge in ways no intelligence report could fully capture. At the top of the American naval command structure, repair was treated as a weapon. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood that he did not command an endless fleet, at least not yet. In 1942, every carrier mattered. That reality shaped decisions that often ran against traditional naval instincts. Ships were rushed back into service with visible scars. Commanders accepted risk in exchange for presence. Admiral Ernest J. King reinforced this approach from Washington. Repair priorities were ruthless. Carriers came first. Battleships could wait. Cruisers and destroyers rotated around them. Shipyard managers were given extraordinary authority to requisition materials, bypass peacetime procedures, and reassign labor without delay. This was not improvisation. It was leadership aligned with industrial reality. Orders from the top made it clear: speed was victory. The effects of this system were felt most sharply at sea. Japanese pilots reported attacking carriers they believed destroyed weeks earlier. American task forces appeared larger than expected. Operational plans built on assumed attrition suddenly faced intact enemy strength. At Midway, Yorktown's presence altered everything, from aircraft allocation to strike timing. At Guadalcanal, damaged carriers rotated through repair cycles fast enough to sustain pressure in a campaign of exhaustion. The Americans could lose decks, planes, even entire squadrons, and still return. For Japanese planners, this was deeply unsettling. Every miscalculation compounded the next. Overestimating damage led to underestimating resistance. Underestimating resistance led to strategic overreach, and overreach in a war of production and recovery was fatal. There was also a quieter difference, one of philosophy. American industry treated repair as an act of defiance. A damaged ship was not a symbol of loss, but of resilience. Each patch was a statement. The enemy had failed to finish the job. In Japan, damage carried a heavier psychological weight. Ships were symbols of national prestige. Their loss, or prolonged absence, echoed beyond the tactical. The industrial system could not easily absorb repeated shocks. This difference shaped morale as much as material outcomes. By late 1942, the pattern was undeniable to those who looked closely. The United States was not merely replacing ships, it was recycling combat power faster than Japan could destroy it. That realization, however, would only fully crystallize when the war reached its most punishing moments, when damaged carriers returned to battle at times and places the enemy did not believe possible. Those moments would form the turning point of the carrier war in the Pacific. The turning point did not arrive all at once. It emerged through a series of moments that, taken together, revealed a truth Japanese admirals could no longer ignore. It began with USS Yorktown. After the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor trailing smoke and uncertainty. She had been struck by bombs that ripped holes in her flight deck, ruptured fuel lines, and flooded compartments deep within the ship. Japanese reconnaissance judged her finished. Their estimates allowed no scenario in which she could return in time to matter. They were wrong. Naval engineers assessed the damage and issued an extraordinary directive: 48 hours. Crews swarmed the ship. Steel plates were welded over gaping wounds. Electrical systems were rerouted. Pumps ran continuously. Entire sections of the deck were resurfaced with timber and steel.
Damage that would normally require months was deferred, improvised, or bypassed. 72 hours after arrival, Yorktown sailed. When she appeared at Midway on June 4th, Japanese planners were stunned, not because she fought, but because she existed. Her presence forced last-minute adjustments to Japanese strike plans, stretched reconnaissance assets, and contributed directly to the chaos that unfolded that morning. Even after being hit again, bombed, and later torpedoed, Yorktown refused to die easily. Her crew fought fires, restored power, and attempted to save her until the very end. Though she was ultimately lost to a submarine attack days later, her role had already reshaped the battle. But Yorktown was not an anomaly. USS Enterprise absorbed damage at Eastern Solomons in August 1942. Bomb hits scarred her deck and killed dozens, yet within weeks she was back at sea. USS Saratoga, torpedoed repeatedly throughout the war, became a symbol of resilience, damaged, repaired, redeployed again and again. Each return defied Japanese expectations. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, both sides suffered heavily. USS Hornet was lost. Enterprise was damaged once more. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho were also hit, their flight decks rendered unusable. Japanese planners believed they had finally equalized the carrier balance. But the repair race told a different story. Enterprise would return to action within weeks. Shokaku would require months. The asymmetry was no longer theoretical, it was operational. American task forces regained strength faster than Japanese planners could adapt. By late 1942, the Pacific Carrier War had become a contest not just of strikes and counterstrikes, but of regeneration. Each battle inflicted damage on both sides. Only one side could consistently turn that damage into temporary inconvenience rather than permanent loss. Japanese admirals began to sense the shift, but understanding lagged behind events. Intelligence estimates continued to assume extended repair times. Operational plans still rested on attrition models that no longer matched reality. And then came Guadalcanal. The campaign stretched the limits of both navies. Carriers rotated in and out of combat, absorbing punishment and returning as quickly as yards allowed. American repair crews worked against unforgiving timelines, knowing that a delay could collapse the entire campaign. They succeeded often enough to change the rhythm of the war. By the end of 1942, Japanese carrier strength had suffered a blow it could not recover from, not solely because of losses, but because damage lingered. American carriers, though battered, remained present. The decisive realization was approaching. The United States could afford to be damaged. Japan could not. That realization would become unmistakable as the carrier war entered its most grinding phase, when time itself became the enemy Japan could no longer outrun.
By early 1943, the illusion of parity was gone. Japanese naval planners reviewed battle reports and repair schedules with growing unease. Carriers, once expected to be absent for half a year, were reappearing in operational summaries far sooner. American task force compositions fluctuated, but they never collapsed. There was always another flight deck available, another air group ready. The realization came quietly, without ceremony. It came in the form of delayed operations, canceled offensives, and cautious deployments. Japanese carriers spent more time guarding what remained than seeking decisive engagement. Each damaged ship represented not just temporary weakness, but a permanent narrowing of options. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward. At Guadalcanal, carrier presence, even intermittent, sustained the campaign. Damaged carriers withdrew, were repaired, and returned. The tempo never fully broke. Japanese forces, lacking the same regenerative capacity, found themselves reacting rather than dictating terms. Repair yards on the American side became strategic hubs. Schedules were synchronized with operations. Commanders planned around known repair windows, confident in turnaround estimates. This confidence was earned, not assumed. Each successful return reinforced the system.
For Japanese admirals, the contrast was stark. Their carriers required careful husbanding. Damage meant months out of action. Skilled labor and materials were scarce. Aircrew losses compounded the problem. Even a repaired ship without trained pilots was only a hull. The Americans suffered pilot losses too, but their training pipeline expanded alongside repair capacity. Ships returned, air groups were replenished, the cycle continued. By mid-1943, the carrier balance tilted decisively. New American carriers began entering service, but even before their arrival, the repair advantage had already reshaped the war. Damaged ships filled the gaps long enough for replacements to arrive. The turning point, then, was not a single battle or sinking. It was the moment Japanese leadership understood, too late, that they were fighting an enemy who could be hurt without being stopped. Every strike that failed to sink an American carrier outright became a missed opportunity. Partial damage no longer shifted the strategic balance. This was the miscalculation at the heart of Japan's carrier war. They had underestimated not American courage or tactics, but American recovery. They had planned for a war of destruction, not regeneration, and by the time this difference became undeniable, the industrial gap had widened beyond repair. From that point forward, Japanese carrier operations grew more conservative, more defensive, and more constrained. The initiative passed permanently to the United States. The consequences of that shift would unfold relentlessly in the months and years that followed, not always in dramatic battles, but in the slow, grinding erosion of Japanese naval power. Those consequences would define the aftermath of the carrier war in the Pacific.
The aftermath of this realization unfolded unevenly, but its direction was unmistakable. Japanese carrier strength did not vanish overnight. What vanished was flexibility. Each remaining carrier became too valuable to risk, yet too damaged or delayed to project power consistently. Repairs stretched on, dockyards filled, steel waited for transport that never came. Skilled workers were diverted to emergencies that multiplied faster than they could be resolved. The loss of experienced air crews compounded the problem. Even when carriers returned to service, their decks were often populated by pilots with fewer hours, less combat seasoning, and limited coordination. A repaired ship without veteran aviators could not recreate the striking power Japan had wielded in 1941. American carriers told a different story. Damage became a recurring inconvenience rather than a strategic crisis. Ships rotated through repair cycles with predictable regularity. Pearl Harbor, Espiritu Santo, and later Ulithi functioned as living arteries of fleet regeneration. A carrier withdrawn today could be expected back in weeks, not seasons. This reliability reshaped American planning. Operations no longer hinged on preserving pristine hulls. Risk tolerance increased. Commanders could accept damage if it meant maintaining pressure. The enemy was forced to respond again and again without respite. Japanese planners found themselves trapped by earlier assumptions. Operational plans written around overestimated American losses collapsed under reality. Each unexpected reappearance forced last-minute adjustments, spreading already thin resources still thinner. By late 1943, the carrier war had lost its earlier symmetry. American task forces operated with confidence rooted not in invulnerability, but in recoverability. Japanese forces operated with caution born of fragility. The repair yards continued their work, unseen by the enemy and largely unseen by history. Their impact was measured not in tonnage launched, but in days shaved off repair timelines. Each day mattered, each hour mattered. And as the war pushed westward across the Pacific, the cumulative effect of this repair advantage began to shape every engagement that followed, from the Marianas to the Philippines, long before the first bombs fell. The strategic consequences were now locked in. They would become even clearer when measured against the broader arc of the war, in numbers, outcomes, and the irreversible shift in momentum that followed.
By 1944, the imbalance created by repair capacity had become structural. American carriers no longer operated at the edge of sustainability. They operated within a system designed to absorb punishment indefinitely. Forward bases like Ulithi Atoll functioned as floating industrial zones, where damaged ships could receive emergency repairs without leaving the theater. Floating dry docks rose from the water like steel islands, capable of lifting carriers clear of the sea for hull work, once thought impossible outside major ports. Japanese forces could not match this tempo. Their remaining carriers spent more time moving between bases and shipyards than projecting power. Fuel shortages slowed everything. Aircrew shortages hollowed out effectiveness. Even when repairs were completed, operational readiness lagged behind American counterparts, who returned not just repaired, but rearmed and retrained. The Battle of the Philippine Sea made the disparity unmistakable. American carriers absorbed damage and continued operations. Japanese carriers lost aircraft and pilots they could not replace. The so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a tactical defeat, it was the visible collapse of a system already weakened by repair limitations and miscalculation. From that point onward, Japanese carrier aviation ceased to function as a decisive arm. The carriers themselves still existed, but they no longer dictated events. They reacted, retreated, and ultimately became decoys, most notably at Leyte Gulf, where remaining Japanese carriers were sacrificed to draw American forces away. By contrast, American carriers grew more numerous and more resilient. New ships entered service, but just as importantly, damaged ones kept returning. The fleet's strength no longer depended on perfection, it depended on continuity. The repair crews never slowed. Even as victory approached, yards remained crowded. Combat damage blended with wear and fatigue. Steel cracked, engines failed, decks warped under constant use, and still the ship sailed. In the final accounting, the Japanese misjudgment was not merely technical, it was philosophical. They had believed war could be decided by destroying platforms. The Americans proved it could be decided by restoring them. The Pacific War ended not with a final carrier duel, but with a sustained American presence that Japan could no longer challenge. That presence was built as much in shipyards as on flight decks, and when the guns finally fell silent, the true weight of that unseen labor became impossible to deny.
History often remembers war through moments of fire, bombs falling, decks burning, aircraft spiraling into the sea. But the Pacific War was decided just as surely in places far from combat, where the only light came from welding torches and the only sound was steel being cut and joined again. Japanese admirals did not misunderstand American courage. They misunderstood American endurance. They believed that damage removed power from the battlefield. They believed that time favored the side that struck hardest. What they failed to grasp was that the United States had built a system where time could be bent, where a shattered ship could return before its absence was fully felt. The men who made this possible did not wear flight suits or command bridges. They wore coveralls. They worked nights without applause. They measured victory in hours saved and systems restored. Their success allowed carriers to fight battles they were never expected to reach. This was the quiet revolution of the Pacific War. It revealed that modern warfare is not only a contest of weapons, but of recovery, not only of destruction, but of repair. The side that can absorb damage in return is not simply resilient, it is dominant. When damaged American carriers returned to battle, they carried more than aircraft. They carried the weight of a national capacity to rebuild faster than an enemy could destroy. And in the end, that capacity, patient, methodical, relentless, proved more decisive than any single strike ever launched from a flight deck.